The canonical Gospels tell them that Jesus appeared to his disciples after resurrection, that he showed his wounds, that he ate with them, that he ascended to heaven 40 days later. But what happened during those 40 days? What did the risen Christ actually teach? The canonical texts provide almost nothing: a few appearances, some reassurances, brief instructions to spread the gospel, and then ascension. 40 days reduced to fragments, to shadows, to silence. But Carl Jung discovered something that changes everything. In his later years, Jung studied apocryphal texts that the Church excluded from biblical canon: the Ethiopian Bible, the Gnostic Gospels, the secret book of James, the Apocalypse of Peter. And in these suppressed texts, he found detailed accounts of what Jesus taught during those 40 days. Not religious doctrines, not theological frameworks, but psychological teachings. A complete map of inner transformation that Jung recognized as identical to what he had independently discovered through decades of clinical work. What he called individuation, the journey from ego consciousness to self-realization, from fragmentation to wholeness, from psychological death to psychological resurrection. Jung's discovery was profound. The apocryphal texts describe Jesus gathering his disciples in secret during the 40 days, teaching them mysteries he had not revealed during his ministry, showing them that his crucifixion and resurrection were not just historical events, but archetypal patterns. Patterns that every human must undergo psychologically, patterns of dying to ego and being reborn as self, patterns of descending into darkness and emerging transformed, patterns of integrating opposites, light and shadow, divine and human, masculine and feminine, into unified wholeness. And Jung realized that these post-resurrection teachings were not religious mythology, were accurate descriptions of psychological transformation, were, in essence, the same process he had mapped as individuation, the same journey he had observed in thousands of patients, the same path he had walked himself during his own confrontation with the unconscious. Jesus, 2,000 years before modern depth psychology, had understood and taught the complete architecture of psychological transformation, and the Church had suppressed it, had buried these teachings, had replaced psychological transformation with belief-based religion, had made salvation about accepting doctrines instead of undergoing inner death and rebirth. The reason for suppression becomes obvious when they understand what Jesus actually taught. He taught that the kingdom of God is within, that resurrection happens psychologically, not just physically, that every person must descend into their own darkness before they can be transformed, that salvation is not external transaction but internal process, that divinity is not outside but within, waiting to be discovered through inner work. These teachings make institutional religion unnecessary, make priests obsolete, make external authority irrelevant. Because if resurrection is psychological process, if kingdom is within, if transformation comes through inner work rather than external belief, then what is the Church for? What purpose does institutional mediation serve? The post-resurrection teachings reveal that Jesus was teaching individuation, was teaching psychological wholeness, was teaching that every person can undergo what he underwent, can die psychologically and be reborn, can integrate shadow and light, can discover the self, what Jesus called the kingdom, what Jung called the divine center of psyche, and this makes every individual potentially autonomous, potentially capable of direct experience without institutional mediation. Today, they are going to see what Jung discovered in his study of post-resurrection teachings, the 4 core revelations Jesus gave during the 40 days. The teaching that resurrection is psychological pattern, not historical miracle. The teaching that shadow must be integrated, not rejected. The teaching that opposites must be unified within consciousness. And the teaching that the kingdom is internal state of psychological wholeness, not external heaven. These four teachings appear consistently across the suppressed texts, and Jung recognized them immediately as description of individuation, as map of the same psychological transformation he had spent his career exploring, as evidence that Jesus understood depth psychology 2 millennia before it was formally articulated, as proof that what the Church calls supernatural miracle is actually natural psychological process available to anyone willing to do the inner work. This is not diminishing Jesus. This is understanding what he actually taught. This is recognizing that his greatest gift was not dying for sins, but demonstrating psychological transformation and teaching others how to undergo it themselves. Make their choice. Which teaching speaks to them? Resurrection as psychological pattern, shadow integration, unity of opposites, internal kingdom, and then stay. Because what comes next will not support traditional Christianity, will not validate belief-based salvation, will not confirm that Jesus' resurrection was a unique supernatural event requiring only faith to access its benefits. It will show them what Jung discovered, that Jesus taught psychological transformation during 40 days after resurrection, that these teachings were suppressed by church because they make institutional religion unnecessary, that the texts describing these teachings still exist in suppressed apocryphal sources, that Jung studied them extensively and recognized their psychological accuracy, that the post-resurrection teachings are not religious mythology, but psychological roadmap. And that understanding what Jesus actually taught during those 40 days changes everything about Christianity, about salvation, about resurrection, about what it means to follow Christ. Not following by believing, following by undergoing. Not accepting external savior, becoming internally transformed, not waiting for heaven after death, discovering kingdom within through psychological work that Jesus mapped during 40 days the church reduced to silence. If they recognize the first teaching, that resurrection is psychological pattern that every person can undergo, they have identified what Jung considered the most revolutionary aspect of post-resurrection teachings. In the secret book of James, Jesus tells his disciples, "The resurrection you witnessed in my body is pattern for what must happen in your consciousness. I died and rose so you could see what each of you must do, not physically, psychologically. You must die to who you think you are and be reborn as who you actually are." Jung understood immediately that this was description of individuation, of ego death, of the psychological transformation where identification with ego dissolves and identification with self emerges. Jesus was not teaching that his resurrection was unique miracle requiring belief, was teaching that his resurrection was demonstration, was showing pattern, was revealing what psychological transformation looks like when completed fully. If this is the teaching that speaks to them, they are recognizing that Christianity fundamentally misunderstood its own central event. The church made resurrection historical miracle, made it supernatural event that happened to Jesus alone, made it something to believe rather than something to undergo, made salvation dependent on accepting that Jesus physically rose from death. And this transformed Christianity from transformation path into belief system, from psychological work into theological ascent, from process to proposition. But the post-resurrection teachings reveal different understanding, reveal that Jesus himself taught resurrection as pattern, not exception, as archetypal process, not historical anomaly, as something that must happen in every consciousness, not just his. Jung found this explicitly stated across multiple apocryphal texts. In the Apocalypse of Peter, Jesus says, "What you call my resurrection is your resurrection waiting to happen. I am not risen so you can believe. I am risen so you can follow, so you can undergo the same death and the same rebirth, so you can discover that death of ego is birth of self." Jung understood this psychologically. He had observed in countless patients what he called psychological death. the moment when ego identification collapses, when who they thought they were dies, when comfortable identity fragments, when psychological structures they relied on dissolve, and patients experiencing this believed they were dying, believed they were losing themselves, believed something terrible was happening. But Jung recognized this as necessary stage of transformation, as death that precedes rebirth, as crucifixion that makes resurrection possible. The ego must die, must let go of its claim to be the totality, must surrender its control, must experience what feels like psychological death. And from that death, if the person does not resist, if they allow the process, something new emerges, something that was always there but obscured by ego identification, the self, the center of wholeness, the integrated consciousness that Jung called divine and that Jesus called the kingdom within. This is what Jesus was teaching during 40 days. Was showing disciples that what they witnessed in his body, crucifixion, death, descent, resurrection, was pattern for what must happen in their psyche, was external demonstration of internal process, was physical enactment of psychological transformation. And the disciples who understood this, who underwent their own psychological crucifixion and resurrection, became what early Christianity called the risen ones, not people who believed Jesus rose, people who had undergone resurrection themselves, who had died to ego, who had been reborn as self, who carried the pattern Jesus demonstrated. This is why early Christian texts describe transformed disciples, describe people who were radically different after the 40 days, not because they witnessed miracle, because they underwent transformation, because Jesus taught them how to die psychologically and be reborn, because they followed pattern instead of just believing in it. But the church could not maintain institutional control with this teaching, could not keep people dependent with message that says you must undergo what Jesus underwent, that resurrection happens in consciousness, that you must die to ego and be reborn as self. That transformation is work you do, not gift you receive through belief. So the teaching was suppressed, was replaced with doctrine that resurrection was unique miracle, that Jesus alone rose, that believing in his resurrection grants you eternal life, that no inner work is required, just faith, just belief, just accepting doctrine. And this created comfortable Christianity, Christianity that requires nothing difficult, nothing transformative, nothing painful, just intellectual assent, just saying you believe. And millions accepted this, accepted belief-based salvation, never knowing that Jesus taught something entirely different during 40 days. Taught that resurrection is pattern you must undergo yourself. Taught that his death and rising was demonstration of what must happen in your consciousness. Taught psychological transformation, not theological belief. Breaking free from belief-based Christianity requires recognizing what Jesus actually taught. They must see that making resurrection unique miracle serves institutional purposes, keeps people dependent on church to access benefits of Christ's resurrection through sacraments. But Jesus' actual teaching, preserved in suppressed texts, says something different, says resurrection is archetypal pattern, says what happened to Jesus physically happens to everyone psychologically, says you must die to ego, must descend into darkness, must confront what you have rejected, must allow old identity to dissolve, must experience psychological death. And from that death, if you do not resist, resurrection happens, not physical, psychological, not body returning to life, but consciousness transforming, ego dying, self-emerging, fragmentation becoming wholeness. This is resurrection. This is what Jesus taught during 40 days. This is what Jung rediscovered. And this is what changes everything about Christianity when you understand that the post-resurrection teaching was not believe in my resurrection, but undergo your own resurrection by following the pattern I demonstrated. Oh, if this teaching resonates, subscribe to see the other 3 core revelations Jesus taught during 40 days. Comment which teaching speaks to you. Your recognition begins the transformation Jesus mapped. If they recognize the second teaching, that shadow must be confronted and integrated, rather than rejected or projected. They have identified what Jung considered perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Jesus's post-resurrection teachings. In the Gospel of Thomas, found among the suppressed texts, Jesus tells his disciples after resurrection, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." Jung recognized this immediately as teaching about shadow, about the rejected, suppressed, denied aspects of psyche that ego refuses to acknowledge. Jesus was teaching that salvation requires integrating what you have rejected, requires bringing forth, making conscious what has been kept unconscious, requires confronting darkness within instead of projecting it onto others. If this is the teaching that speaks to them, they are recognizing that Jesus understood depth psychology's most difficult work, shadow integration. The church created theology of good versus evil, of light rejecting darkness, of righteousness excluding sin, of saved separating from damned. This is splitting, is what Jung called psychological fragmentation that prevents wholeness, because wholeness requires integrating opposites, not choosing one side, requires acknowledging that you contain both light and shadow, both capacity for good and capacity for evil, both divine and demonic potentials. And refusing to acknowledge shadow does not make it disappear, makes it unconscious, makes it projected, makes it act autonomously in ways ego does not recognize as coming from self. Jung observed this in every patient. The person who cannot acknowledge their rage projects it onto others, seeing everyone else as angry. The person who cannot accept their sexuality suppresses it, then judges others as immoral. The person who cannot own their shadow becomes what they most despise because unconscious shadow possesses them without their awareness. But the post-resurrection teachings reveal that Jesus understood this completely. In the secret book of James, Jesus says to disciples, "You must descend into the place you fear most, into the darkness within you, into what you have rejected about yourself. And there you will find not demon, but divine potential trapped by your rejection. The darkness you fear contains the light you need." This is precise description of shadow work, of the process Jung mapped, where you must consciously confront what ego has rejected, must examine the qualities you judge in others and recognize they exist in you, must acknowledge the capacity for evil alongside capacity for good, must bring unconscious material into consciousness, not to indulge it but to integrate it, to transform it through awareness, to reclaim the energy that was locked in suppression. And this integration is what Jesus called bringing forth what is within you, is making conscious the unconscious, is shadow work. Jung discovered that Jesus taught shadow integration through his own example. The crucifixion itself is shadow work. Jesus did not just die for sins abstractly. He took on collective shadow, became scapegoat, carried what the collective projected onto him, all the rage, all the rejection, all the darkness that people could not acknowledge in themselves. And his resurrection demonstrated that confronting shadow does not destroy you, transforms you, that descending into darkness is necessary for ascending into light, that integrating shadow is path to wholeness. This is why Jesus during 40 days kept emphasizing descent, kept telling disciples they must go down before they can go up, must confront darkness before they can access light, must acknowledge shadow before they can realize self. This is not evil. This is wholeness. This is integration. This is what Jung called individuation requiring shadow work as essential stage, The disciples who understood this underwent radical transformation. The texts describe them confronting their own darkness. Peter acknowledging his betrayal as shadow material, requiring integration, not just forgiveness. Thomas acknowledging his doubt as legitimate questioning rather than faithlessness. Judas, in the Gnostic Gospel of Judas that Jung studied, being revealed as the one who understood most deeply because he was willing to carry shadow role, to be rejected, to do what was necessary for transformation, even though it meant being demonized. Jung saw in these post-resurrection accounts that Jesus was teaching disciples to integrate their shadow, to acknowledge their capacity for betrayal, doubt, denial, to bring forth what they had suppressed, to become whole rather than remaining split into acceptable light and rejected darkness. But the church could not teach this, could not tell people to acknowledge their shadow, to recognize their capacity for evil, to integrate darkness into consciousness. Because this makes morality complex, makes salvation require psychological work rather than just choosing good and rejecting evil. Makes people responsible for integrating their own darkness rather than depending on church to absolve them of sin through confession and penance. So the teaching was suppressed, was replaced with theology of rejecting shadow, of confessing sin to external authority, of being cleansed by church rather than integrating shadow yourself. And this created perpetual dependence. Created people who could not become whole because wholeness requires what church forbids, acknowledging and integrating shadow. Breaking free from shadow rejection requires following what Jesus actually taught during 40 days. They must recognize that the darkness they fear is not demonic possession, is shadow, is rejected parts of psyche that must be brought into consciousness. They must practice what Jung learned from these texts, examining their judgments, recognizing their projections, acknowledging their capacity for what they condemn in others, must bring forth what is within, make conscious what has been unconscious, must descend into their own darkness and discover that it contains not destruction, but potential, not evil, but unlived life, not demon, but divine energy trapped by rejection. This is shadow work. This is what Jesus taught during 40 days. This is what Jung rediscovered. This is what creates wholeness, not rejecting shadow, integrating it, not choosing light and excluding darkness. Unifying opposites into conscious wholeness that Jesus demonstrated and taught is available to everyone willing to do the difficult work of confronting and integrating what they have spent their life rejecting. If they recognize the third teaching, that psychological wholeness requires unifying opposites rather than choosing one side, they have identified what Jung considered the most sophisticated psychological insight in Jesus's post-resurrection teachings. In multiple apocryphal texts, Jesus repeatedly teaches during the 40 days what Jung called the coincidentia oppositorum, the unity of opposites. In the Gospel of Philip, Jesus says, "Light and darkness, life and death, right and left, are brothers of one another. They are inseparable. Because of this, neither are the good good, nor the evil evil, nor is life life, nor death death. For this reason, each will dissolve into its original nature." Jung recognized this as teaching about psychological integration, about transcending dualistic thinking, about achieving consciousness that holds both poles simultaneously, rather than identifying with one and rejecting the other. If this teaching speaks to them, they are recognizing that Jesus was teaching what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension of opposites until new consciousness emerges. The Church created dualistic theology, heaven and hell, saved and damned, good and evil, faith and doubt, spirit and flesh, each dichotomy forcing choice. Forcing identification with one pole and rejection of the other. And this creates splitting, creates fragmentation, creates consciousness that is half of what it could be because it has rejected half of itself. Jung observed that this dualistic thinking prevents wholeness, because wholeness is not achieved by choosing light over darkness, is achieved by integrating both, not by choosing spirit over flesh, by unifying both, not by choosing faith over doubt, by holding both. This is what Jesus was teaching during 40 days. This is what the apocryphal texts preserve. This is what the church suppressed, because unified consciousness does not need institutional religion to tell it which pole to choose. In the Apocalypse of Peter, Jesus shows disciples vision of unity, shows them that heaven and hell are not separate places, but opposite poles of same reality, that they exist simultaneously. That consciousness can perceive both. That wholeness requires integrating both rather than choosing one. Jung saw this as teaching about psychological opposites, about how ego naturally splits experience into binary categories: good, bad, right, wrong, acceptable, unacceptable, and identifies with one pole while projecting the other. But self, the center of wholeness, transcends these dualities, contains both poles, integrates opposites into unified consciousness that is paradoxical, complex, capable of holding contradiction. This is what Jesus demonstrated through his own nature, fully human and fully divine, fully suffering and fully transcendent, fully crucified and fully resurrected, not choosing one pole, embodying both. The post-resurrection teachings make this explicit. Jesus tells disciples they must become like him, must integrate the opposites he integrated, must be both human and divine, must acknowledge both shadow and light, must be both strong and vulnerable, must contain both masculine and feminine, must hold both certainty and doubt, must integrate both life and death. And this integration creates what Jesus called being born again. Not conversion to new belief, but psychological rebirth into unified consciousness. Jung recognized this as individuation, as the process where ego's one-sided consciousness is dissolved and self's unified consciousness emerges, where opposites are no longer fighting but integrated, where paradox is no longer problem but reality, where complexity is no longer confusion but wholeness. Jung found that Jesus taught specific practices for integrating opposites during the 40 days. In the secret book of James, Jesus instructs disciples to meditate on pairs of opposites, to hold both consciously, to resist the urge to choose one side, to sit with the tension until new understanding emerges. This is precisely what Jung called active imagination, what he taught his patients as method for integrating opposites. You hold two contradictory truths simultaneously. You allow the tension. You do not collapse into either pole. You wait. And from that waiting, from that holding of tension, something new emerges, a third position, a transcendent perspective that includes both poles, but is limited to neither. This is psychological transformation. This is what Jesus was teaching. This is how unified consciousness develops. The disciples who mastered this teaching became what the texts call the unified ones. There'd be people who could hold paradox, who could be both strong and gentle, both wise and humble, both certain and questioning, both engaged with world and detached from it. Jung recognized these descriptions as portraits of individuated people, people who had achieved the psychological wholeness that comes from integrating opposites. And he saw that this wholeness is what Jesus meant by the kingdom of God, not external place, not future reward, but present state of unified consciousness, of integrated psyche, of self-realized within ego, of opposites transcended through inclusion rather than through choice. But the church could not teach this, could not tell people to integrate opposites, to hold both faith and doubt, to be both spirit and flesh, to acknowledge both good and evil within themselves, because this makes religion complex, makes salvation require psychological sophistication rather than simple belief, makes people autonomous rather than dependent on external authority to tell them which pole to choose. So the teaching was suppressed, was replaced with dualistic theology that forces choice. That says you must choose faith over doubt, spirit over flesh, good over evil, heaven over hell. And this keeps people fragmented, keeps them dependent, keeps them from achieving the unified consciousness that Jesus taught is the actual kingdom. Breaking free from dualistic religion requires practicing what Jesus taught during 40 days. They must learn to hold opposites, must practice noticing when they collapse into one pole, must consciously hold both faith and doubt, both strength and vulnerability, both certainty and questioning, must resist ego's urge to resolve tension by choosing one side, must allow the discomfort of paradox, must wait for the transcendent function to emerge, for the new consciousness that integrates both poles. This is difficult work. Ego hates it, wants resolution, wants to choose, wants certainty. But wholeness requires what Jesus taught, staying in tension until opposites integrate, until consciousness expands enough to hold both, until self emerges from the unified field that ego's dualistic thinking could never access. This is the third teaching, unity of opposites. Transcendence through integration. Wholeness through holding paradox. What Jesus demonstrated in his nature and taught during 40 days, and what Jung rediscovered as essential to individuation. If they recognize the fourth teaching, that the kingdom of God is not external place but internal state of psychological wholeness, they have identified what Jung considered the culminating revelation of Jesus's post-resurrection teachings. Across multiple apocryphal texts, Jesus repeatedly emphasizes during the 40 days, the kingdom is not coming in a way that can be observed, nor will they say, look, here it is, or there it is. The kingdom of God is within you. Jung understood this as teaching that what religion calls heaven is actually psychological state, is the experience of integrated consciousness, is what happens when ego and self unify, when shadow is integrated, when opposites are held, when fragmentation becomes wholeness. If this teaching speaks to them, they are recognizing that Jesus was not teaching about afterlife destination, but about present psychological transformation, not about where you go when you die, but about who you become when you individuate. The church made kingdom external, made it heaven after death, made it reward for belief and obedience, made it future destination requiring church mediation to access. And this served institutional purposes perfectly. Because if kingdom is external and future, you need church to get there, need sacraments to qualify, need priests to mediate, need to remain dependent on institution that controls access. But Jesus's actual teaching, preserved in texts the church suppressed, says something entirely different, says kingdom is internal and present, says it is state of consciousness you access through inner work, says it is psychological transformation, not geographical destination, says it is here and now for those who have done the work of integration. And this makes church unnecessary, makes external authority irrelevant, makes every person potentially capable of accessing kingdom directly through psychological work Jesus mapped. Jung discovered that when Jesus spoke of kingdom during 40 days, he was describing what Jung called the self, the integrated totality, the center of wholeness that contains and transcends ego. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, the kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. Jung saw this as teaching about self-realization, about discovering the divine center within psyche, about recognizing that what you seek externally is actually internal, that the God you worship outside is the self you must discover inside. That the kingdom you believe is future destination is actually present potential, waiting to be actualized through psychological work. This is not atheism. This is not denying divine. This is relocating divine from external heaven to internal depth, from future reward to present possibility, from belief-based hope to experience-based knowing. The post-resurrection teachings describe kingdom as state characterized by specific psychological qualities: peace that transcends understanding, joy independent of circumstances, love that includes shadow, wholeness that integrates opposites, consciousness that holds paradox. These are not supernatural gifts, are natural results of individuation, are what emerges when psychological work is completed. When shadow is integrated, peace emerges because you are no longer at war with yourself. When opposites unify, joy emerges because you are no longer fractured. When self realizes, love emerges because you recognize yourself in others. This is kingdom. This is what Jesus was teaching. This is the state of consciousness that the text described disciples accessing during the 40 days. Not because they believed harder, because they did the inner work Jesus taught, because they underwent resurrection pattern, because they integrated shadow, because they unified opposites, because they discovered kingdom within. Jung worked with patients who experienced this state, who through individuation work accessed what they could only describe as kingdom, as profound peace, as deep joy, as unconditional love, as sense of being home, as consciousness that felt more real than normal waking consciousness. And these patients described it exactly as the apocryphal texts describe disciples experiencing during 40 days with resurrected Jesus. Described it as being in presence of self, as accessing divine dimension of psyche, as discovering that what they sought their entire life was within them all along, as finding kingdom, not in afterlife, in present moment, not in external heaven, in internal depths, not through believing, through individuating. Through doing the work Jesus taught, transforms consciousness from ego identification to self-realization. The texts reveal that Jesus, during 40 days, took disciples through experiential practices, not just teachings, practices, methods for accessing kingdom. Jung found descriptions that match what he developed as active imagination, as meditation on symbols, as dialogue with unconscious, as practices that shift consciousness from ego to self. Jesus taught disciples to go within, to sit in silence, to allow images to emerge, to dialogue with inner figures, to access the kingdom that exists as potential in every psyche, but that requires conscious work to actualize. This is not supernatural mysticism. This is natural psychology. Is using practices that shift consciousness from ordinary ego awareness to expanded self-awareness. Is what Jung called the religious function of psyche, the natural capacity to access transpersonal dimensions that exist within consciousness itself. But the Church could not maintain institutional control with this teaching, could not keep people dependent with message that kingdom is within you, that you access it through inner work, that no external mediation is required, that church attendance and sacramental participation are not necessary for kingdom access, so the teaching was suppressed, was replaced with doctrine that kingdom is external heaven, that you get there by believing church-defined doctrines, that you need church mediation to qualify, that kingdom is future reward, not present possibility, and this kept people dependent, kept them looking outside instead of within, kept them believing instead of experiencing, kept them waiting for afterlife instead of accessing the state of wholeness that Jesus taught is available now through the inner work he mapped during 40 days. Breaking free from external kingdom theology requires practicing what Jesus actually taught. They must turn inward, must develop practices that shift consciousness from ego to self, must learn to access the kingdom within through meditation, through active imagination, through dream work, through the methods Jung adapted from these very texts, must discover experientially that kingdom is not place, but state, not future, but present, not external, but internal, not achieved through belief, but accessed through consciousness work. This is the fourth teaching, kingdom within, state of wholeness, present possibility, psychological reality. What Jesus taught during 40 days and what Jung rediscovered and what changes everything about Christianity when you understand that the post-resurrection revelation was not believe and go to heaven when you die, but do inner work and access kingdom now within your own consciousness. Now that they have seen the four core teachings Jesus revealed during the 40 days, resurrection as psychological pattern, shadow integration, unity of opposites, kingdom within, it is time to integrate what Jung discovered these teachings mean collectively. Together, they form complete map of psychological transformation. They describe what Jung spent his career articulating as individuation, the journey from ego consciousness to self-realization, from fragmentation to wholeness, from identification with partial consciousness to experience of total consciousness. And Jung's profound discovery was that Jesus had taught this complete process 2,000 years before depth psychology formally articulated it, had taught it during 40 days after resurrection, had taught it to disciples who underwent transformation, had taught it in ways that were recorded in apocryphal texts. And the Church had systematically suppressed these texts because the teachings they contain make institutional religion unnecessary. Jung understood that the post-resurrection teachings work as integrated system. You cannot undergo resurrection, psychological death and rebirth, without shadow work, cannot integrate shadow without holding opposites, cannot hold opposites without accessing the consciousness that kingdom represents. Each teaching depends on and leads to the others. Together, they describe complete transformational arc. You begin where most people remain, identified with ego, rejecting shadow, choosing one pole of dualities, seeking externally for what is internal. Then you undergo first teaching. You must die psychologically, must let ego identification dissolve, must experience the crucifixion of comfortable identity. This is terrifying, feels like actual death, but it is necessary, is the death that precedes resurrection, is pattern Jesus demonstrated. From ego death, you move to second teaching, shadow integration, because once ego's defenses dissolve, shadow material emerges. All the rejected, suppressed, denied aspects flood consciousness, and you must integrate them, must acknowledge your capacity for evil alongside capacity for good, must bring forth what is within, must make conscious what was unconscious. This is excruciating work, requires confronting what you have spent lifetime avoiding, requires admitting what you have projected onto others exists in you, but integration transforms, reclaims energy that was locked in suppression, provides strength that comes from wholeness rather than one-sidedness, and prepares for third teaching, unifying opposites, because shadow integration is just beginning of holding opposites. You must learn to hold many polarities, faith and doubt, strength and vulnerability, certainty and questioning, masculine and feminine, light and dark. And holding these without collapsing into one pole creates tension, creates discomfort, creates what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. From this sustained tension, if you do not collapse, if you allow the process, fourth teaching emerges. Kingdom consciousness. The transcendent function activates. New consciousness arises that is neither pole but includes both. This is self-realization. This is what Jesus called kingdom within. This is state of integrated wholeness, where ego and self unify, where conscious and unconscious communicate, where you know yourself as both human and divine, both finite and infinite, both individual and universal. This is not supernatural mysticism. This is natural result of completing the process Jesus taught, of undergoing resurrection pattern, of integrating shadow, of unifying opposites, of accessing the consciousness that was always potential but required work to actualize. Jung saw the disciples described in apocryphal texts underwent exactly this process during 40 days. Underwent psychological death as their understanding of Jesus and themselves dissolved. Integrated shadow as they confronted their betrayals, denials, doubts. Unified opposites as Jesus taught them to hold paradox. Accessed kingdom as they experienced transformed consciousness. The texts describe disciples becoming radically different, becoming the transformed ones, becoming people who carried something others could not explain, could not understand, could not replicate through belief alone, because they had undergone the process, had walked the path, had done the work Jesus taught during 40 days. This is why early Christianity was transformative, not because people believed Jesus rose, because disciples taught others how to undergo resurrection themselves, taught shadow work, taught holding opposites, taught accessing kingdom within, taught transformation, not belief. But institutional Christianity suppressed this, replaced transformation path with belief system, replaced doing the work with accepting doctrine, replaced psychological resurrection with historical miracle you believe in, rather than pattern you undergo. And this created comfortable Christianity, Christianity requiring no inner work, no confrontation with shadow, no holding of opposites, no accessing kingdom through consciousness transformation, just belief. Just accepting that Jesus rose and that believing this grants salvation. And millions chose this easier path, never knowing that Jesus taught something entirely different during 40 days, taught complete map of psychological transformation, taught individuation, before it was called individuation, taught the work that Jung rediscovered through decades of clinical observation and study of suppressed texts. The integration Jung offers is simple but profound. The post-resurrection teachings are not religious mythology. Our psychological roadmap, our accurate description of transformation process that depth psychology has now formally articulated as individuation. And following this roadmap does not require religious belief, requires psychological work, requires practicing what Jesus taught, requires undergoing resurrection pattern by allowing ego death, requires integrating shadow by making unconscious conscious, requires unifying opposites by holding tension, requires accessing kingdom by shifting consciousness from ego to self. This is the work. This is what 40 days teaching was about. This is what Jung discovered in suppressed texts. And this is what changes everything when you understand that Christianity was originally transformation path, that church replaced with belief system, and that the original teachings still exist, still describe accurate psychological process, still provide map for anyone willing to do the work rather than just believe the doctrine. So now they understand what Jesus taught during 40 days and what Jung discovered in suppressed texts. But understanding is not transformation. Practice is required. The daily, difficult, specific practices that Jesus taught disciples and that Jung adapted for modern psychological work. These are not religious rituals, are psychological methods, are practical techniques for undergoing the four teachings, for experiencing resurrection pattern, for integrating shadow, for unifying opposites, for accessing kingdom. Here are the practices that the post-resurrection texts describe and that Jung incorporated into his analytical method. First practice is conscious ego death. This requires recognizing where they are over-identified with ego, where they believe they are their roles, their achievements, their identity structures. They must practice questioning, who am I without my job, without my relationships, without my accomplishments, without my beliefs? This questioning dissolves ego's certainty, creates the death Jesus taught is necessary. They practice this daily. Sit with the discomfort of not knowing who they are. Allow identity to destabilize. Resist the urge to quickly rebuild ego structure. This is psychological crucifixion, is death of who they think they are, is necessary for resurrection of who they actually are. The text describe Jesus instructing disciples to practice this, to spend time in darkness, to allow dissolution, to die to familiar identity. Jung taught same practice, called it ego deflation, called it necessary stage before self can emerge. Second practice is shadow dialogue. Jung found detailed descriptions in apocryphal texts of Jesus teaching disciples to dialogue with their rejected parts, to personify what they have suppressed, to engage it consciously. They practice this through active imagination. They sit quietly, allow image of their shadow to appear, give it form, give it voice, and they dialogue. Who are you? What do you want? What do you bring? And they listen, not with judgment, with curiosity. The shadow might appear as dark figure, as animal, as threatening presence. But as they dialogue, as they listen, as they integrate, the shadow transforms, reveals gifts, reveals energy, reveals potential that was locked in rejection. This is bringing forth what is within. This is shadow work. This is what Jesus taught during 40 days and what Jung adapted as fundamental practice. They do this regularly, weekly, monthly. Whenever they notice strong judgment of another, that's projection of shadow, requiring integration. Third practice is holding opposites consciously. Jesus taught specific method for this that Jung found in Secret Book of James. You identify a polarity you experience: faith, doubt, strength, vulnerability, certainty, questioning, and you consciously hold both. You write both poles, you feel both, you resist collapsing into either. You sit with the tension and you wait. You do not force resolution, you allow. And from this allowing, from this sustained holding of tension, something emerges. A third position, a transcendent perspective, a consciousness that includes both poles, but is limited to neither. They practice this with every either-or they encounter. Every time they feel pressure to choose one pole, they practice holding both, staying in tension, waiting for transcendent function. This is difficult, uncomfortable. Ego hates it. But this is how unified consciousness develops, how opposites integrate, how wholeness emerges. Fourth practice is accessing kingdom through meditation. The texts describe Jesus teaching disciples to sit in silence, to turn inward, to allow consciousness to shift from ego to self. Jung recognized this as meditation practice, as method for accessing what he called the objective psyche. They practice this daily. They sit quietly. They breathe. They allow thoughts to pass. They do not engage ego's constant commentary. They wait. They allow consciousness to drop below surface ego awareness. And in that depth, they encounter something, sometimes images, sometimes feelings, sometimes presence, sometimes just peace. This is kingdom. This is the state Jesus taught is accessed through inner practice, not belief, practice, not doctrine, method, not theology, psychology. They do this daily, even 5 minutes, even when nothing seems to happen, because consistent practice gradually shifts consciousness, gradually makes kingdom accessible, gradually actualizes what Jesus taught is potential in every consciousness. Fifth practice is journaling the process. Jung insisted on this, found that Jesus had instructed disciples to record their experiences during 40 days, to document transformation, to create map for others. They practice this. They write about ego deaths they experience, about shadow material they encounter, about opposites they hold, about kingdom states they access, not for publication, for consciousness. Because writing makes explicit what is implicit, makes conscious what is vague. provides record of transformation that they can review, can see patterns in, can recognize progress through. The texts suggest disciples' transformation was documented, was shared, became teaching for others. Jung did same with Red Book, documented his own confrontation with unconscious, his own resurrection process, his own shadow work, his own kingdom access, and this documentation helped others, provided map. Provided encouragement, provided evidence, transformation is possible. Sixth practice is finding others doing the work. Jesus, during 40 days, created community of transformed disciples, people undergoing same process, supporting each other, sharing experiences, learning together. Jung emphasized this, called it essential, because individuation is individual work, but cannot be done in complete isolation, requires others who understand, who have undergone similar transformation, who can witness, who can support, who can challenge. They must find or create this, find analytical community, find depth psychology groups, find people studying Jung, find people practicing transformation rather than just believing doctrines, because doing this work alone is nearly impossible. Community sustains, community encourages, community provides mirror for seeing what you cannot see alone. These 6 practices, ego death, shadow dialogue, holding opposites, meditation, journaling, community, are what Jesus taught during 40 days according to suppressed texts, are what Jung adapted as analytical methods, are practical techniques for undergoing the transformation that post-resurrection teachings describe. They are not easy, not comfortable, not quick, but they work. They create psychological transformation. They provide path from ego to self. They actualize kingdom within. They fulfill what Jesus taught is possible for every human willing to do the work, rather than just believe the doctrine. They have walked through something today that fundamentally challenges traditional Christianity. They have seen what Carl Jung discovered in his study of suppressed apocryphal texts, that Jesus spent 40 days after resurrection teaching disciples not religious doctrines, but psychological transformation, that he taught resurrection is pattern to undergo, not miracle to believe, that shadow must be integrated, not rejected, that opposites must be unified, not chosen between, that kingdom is internal state, not external place, and that these teachings form complete map of what Jung called individuation, of psychological transformation from ego consciousness to self-realization, of the journey from fragmentation to wholeness that Jesus underwent and taught others to undergo. And the Church systematically suppressed these teachings, replaced transformation path with belief system, replaced inner work with doctrinal assent, replaced psychological resurrection with historical miracle requiring only faith. Carl Jung devoted significant attention to recovering these suppressed teachings, studied the apocryphal texts, recognized their psychological accuracy, saw that Jesus was teaching individuation 2,000 years before psychology articulated it, and integrated these teachings into his own work. His methods of shadow integration came directly from studying post-resurrection texts. His understanding of holding opposites was informed by Jesus' teaching of coincidentia oppositorum. His emphasis on the self as goal of development matched Jesus' teaching of kingdom within. Jung was not being anti-Christian, was recovering original Christianity, was showing that before Church made Christianity about belief, Jesus had made it about transformation, about psychological work, about inner death and rebirth, about becoming whole through the practices he taught during 40 days to disciples who underwent radical transformation. But Jung also understood why Church suppressed these teachings, understood that transformation path cannot maintain institutional control, cannot keep people dependent on external authority, cannot require priests, sacraments, church mediation when messages kingdom is within you, resurrection happens through inner work, transformation comes through practices you do yourself, Transformation path creates autonomous individuals, people who know from direct experience, who have accessed kingdom themselves, who have undergone resurrection pattern, who have integrated shadow, who have unified opposites. And autonomous individuals do not need institutional religion, do not need to be told what to believe, do not need external authority to validate their experience, do not need church to mediate their relationship with divine, because they have discovered divine within through the work Jesus taught. So church replaced transformation with transaction, made salvation about believing Jesus rose instead of undergoing resurrection yourself, made it about accepting doctrine instead of doing inner work, made it comfortable, made it easy, made it require nothing but intellectual assent. And millions chose this easier path, never knowing that Jesus taught something entirely different during 40 days, never knowing that the texts describing those teachings still exist in suppressed apocryphal sources, never knowing that Jung studied those texts extensively and recognized their psychological accuracy, never knowing that transformation is possible, that resurrection can be experienced, that kingdom can be accessed. That wholeness can be achieved through the practices Jesus taught and that Jung adapted for modern psychological work. Which teaching spoke to them? Resurrection as pattern they must undergo, shadow integration they must do, opposites they must unify, kingdom they must access within. And having heard these teachings, what will they do? Will they continue with belief-based Christianity? Continue accepting that Jesus rose and that believing this grants salvation? Continue waiting for external kingdom in afterlife? Or will they do what Jesus actually taught during 40 days? Will they undergo resurrection pattern by allowing ego death? Will they integrate shadow by making unconscious conscious? Will they unify opposites by holding tension? Will they access kingdom by shifting consciousness from ego to self? Will they follow transformation path instead of belief system? Share which teaching resonated. Your recognition might help someone else discover that Christianity was originally transformation path. Subscribe to continue this exploration of what Jesus actually taught and what Jung rediscovered in suppressed texts. 2 more videos appearing now. Choose one. Until they meet again, remember this: the 40 days after resurrection were not empty time, were intensive teaching period where Jesus revealed to disciples the complete map of psychological transformation, taught them resurrection is pattern to undergo, taught them shadow must be integrated, taught them opposites must be unified, taught them kingdom is within. These teachings were recorded in apocryphal texts that church suppressed because they make institutional religion unnecessary, make transformation personal work rather than institutional transaction, make salvation psychological process rather than theological belief. Carl Jung recovered these teachings, recognized their accuracy, integrated them into depth psychology, showed that Jesus understood individuation 2,000 years before it was formally articulated, and offered path back to original Christianity, not Christianity of belief and doctrine and institutional control, but Christianity of transformation and practice and inner work, Christianity where you follow Jesus not by believing he rose, but by undergoing resurrection yourself, not by accepting doctrine, but by doing the work. Not by depending on church, but by accessing kingdom within through the practices he taught during 40 days that Jung preserved and that remain available to anyone willing to do what Jesus actually taught. Undergo psychological death, integrate shadow, unify opposites, access kingdom. This is transformation. This is what 40 days teaching was about. This is what suppressed texts preserve. This is what Jung rediscovered. And this is what changes everything when you understand that the secret Jesus revealed after death was not religious mystery, but psychological map. Not doctrine to believe, but process to undergo. Not external salvation to accept, but internal transformation to achieve. The teachings are preserved, the path is mapped, the work is clear, and it waits for anyone brave enough to follow Jesus by doing what he taught, rather than just believing what church says about him.